From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We're saying, let's put a moratorium on tax foreclosures until we can ensure that those people, delinquent tax owners, have not been unconstitutionally assessed.
A class action lawsuit has been filed against Detroit, alleging the city's housing policies have robbed African Americans of their homes and widened the racial wealth gap. We'll speak to Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and Professor Bernadette Atuahene. Then it's Valentine's Day, or V-Day. We'll look at 1 Billion Rising, the global campaign to end rape and sexual violence against women and girls.
Happy V-Day, happy 1 Billion Rising Day. This year, I think we are really looking at how artistic expression merged with activism has the potential to really empower, encourage, open up the human spirit so that it can rise above the current low vibrational state that we're in the world right now.
We'll speak to playwright Eve Ensler and singer Taina Asili. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate voted 55-45 to pass a resolution limiting President Trump's authority to attack Iran without congressional approval. The vote comes over a month after Trump ordered the targeted assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani at the Baghdad International Airport, sparking a crisis that brought Iran and the U.S. to the brink of outright war. This is Illinois Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth speaking Thursday.
It's been 5 weeks since President Trump stomped on the Constitution, circumvented Congress, and launched a strike that killed General Soleimani. Now, while I am glad the man is dead, I am glad he has gone to meet his maker. I will tell you that that decision put everyday Americans at greater risk because he did not have a good plan for how to react to the aftermath of the war.
Attorney General William Barr criticized President Trump Thursday, saying Trump's tweets about the case of his longtime friend and former campaign advisor Roger Stone are making it impossible for Barr to do his job. This is Barr in an interview with ABC.
To have public statements and tweets made about the department, about our people in the department, our men and women here, about cases pending in the department, and about judges before whom we have cases, make it impossible for me to do my job and to assure the courts and the prosecutors in the department that we're doing our work with integrity.
Earlier this week, Attorney General Barr intervened in Roger Stone's case after Trump went on a late-night Twitter rampage attacking federal prosecutors and calling the initial sentence of 7 to 9 years a miscarriage of justice. 4 federal prosecutors withdrew from the Stone case, and 1 resigned from his job entirely over the intervention. Democratic lawmakers are criticizing Attorney General Barr, with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi calling him one of Trump's henchmen, and Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal calling on Barr to resign. Democratic presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg is facing criticism over a recently resurfaced video clip that shows him blaming the 2008 mortgage and financial crisis on the elimination of the long-standing racist lending policy known as redlining. This is Georgetown University President John DeGioia speaking to Bloomberg in 2008.
It probably all started back when there was a lot of pressure on banks to make loans to everyone. Redlining, if you remember, was the term where banks took whole neighborhoods and said, people in these neighborhoods are poor, they're not going to be able to pay off their mortgages, tell them your salesmen don't go into those areas. And then Congress got involved, as local elected officials as well, and said, oh, that's not fair, these people should be able to get credit. And once you started pushing in that direction, banks started making more and more loans where the credit of the person buying the the House wasn't as good as you would like.
Historians condemn Bloomberg's comment as widely inaccurate. As Ta-Nehisi Coates has explained, the long history of discriminatory housing practices like redlining actually helped set the stage for the financial crisis, not the elimination of these racist policies. Award-winning author and professor Ibram X. Kendi said the recently resurfaced audio of Bloomberg is, quote, beyond racist and disqualifying. Redlining stopped our wealth building. The 2008 crisis led to the largest loss of black wealth in history. This is a double punch onto the historic gut of African Americans, Kendi said. Meanwhile, GQ magazine is reporting Bloomberg and his companies have faced nearly 40 sexual harassment and discrimination lawsuits brought by 64 women over the past several decades. In more presidential election news, former Vice President Joe Biden held a pair of fundraisers in Manhattan Thursday night with top Wall Street executives. Among those on the guest list obtained by CNBC were Jonathan Gray of Blackstone, Alan Hartman of Centerview Partners, Ray McGuire of Citigroup, John Mack, former CEO of Morgan Stanley. The fundraisers come as Biden lagged far behind in the first two primary contests in Iowa and New Hampshire. Meanwhile, the Iowa Democratic Party chairman has resigned after the caucus results were delayed and riddled with errors and inconsistencies. Former Ohio State wrestler Adam DeSabato accused Republican Ohio Congressmember Jim Jordan of begging him not to corroborate the widespread sexual abuse perpetrated by University doctor Richard Strauss after DeSabato's brother Mike exposed the abuse. This is Adam DeSabato testifying Wednesday in a public hearing in the Ohio State Legislature.
Jim Jordan called me crying, groveling on the 4th of July, begging me to go against my brother, begging me, crying for a half hour. That's the kind of cover-ups that's going on there.
In environmental news, a series of recent measurements are raising alarm bells about the accelerating climate crisis. Temperatures in Antarctica soared last week to nearly 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The World Meteorological Organization is reviewing the temperature reading to decide whether it qualifies as the continent's hottest temperature on record. Measurements from NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, meanwhile, show the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere hit a record high Monday, and last month was the hottest January on record. NOAA says the 4 hottest Januaries on record have all occurred since 2016. Indigenous protests and blockades across Canada have forced CN Rail and Via Rail to shut down huge swatches of their railway lines as First Nations across Canada resist the construction of TransCanada's 400-mile, $4.7 billion Coastal GasLink pipeline. The blockades have crippled rail transportation across Canada as Mohawk and other Indigenous land defenders demand the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, withdraw from the Wet'suwet'en Sovereign Territory in northern British Columbia. To see our full coverage of the pipeline struggle, go to DemocracyNow.org. The massive resistance to the Coastal GasLink pipeline comes as The Intercept reveals how a Canadian fossil fuel company essentially bought a unit of an Oregon Sheriff's Department in order to monitor opposition to its proposed LNG, or liquid natural gas, pipeline and export terminal. The investigation reveals how Pembina Pipeline Corp., the owner of the planned Jordan Cove project, was the sole funder of the unit of the Coos County Sheriff's Office in Oregon that has spent years surveilling opposition to the project's construction in southern Oregon. Last year, staff of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission said the Jordan Cove project would adversely affect at least 18 threatened and endangered species in and around Coos Bay. A federal judge has temporarily blocked Microsoft from working on a $10 billion Pentagon cloud contract. The ruling comes after Amazon sued to block the contract, alleging the Pentagon did not fairly evaluate Amazon's bid because President Trump had intervened, telling former Defense Secretary James Mattis to, quote, screw Amazon, unquote, out of the deal in 2018. This claim surfaced in a book written by Mattis's former speechwriter. Amazon argued its bid was not fairly evaluated because Trump considers Amazon head Jeff Bezos, who also owns The Washington Post, as Trump's political enemy. The nation's second-largest publisher of local newspapers has filed for bankruptcy in the latest signal of the financial crisis in the journalism world. McClatchy is the owner of the Miami Herald, the Kansas City Star, the Sacramento Bee, the Charlotte Observer, the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram in Texas, among other local papers. It recently won a Pulitzer Prize for the Miami Herald's reporting on Jeffrey Epstein, but it's been plagued by layoffs and financial troubles. McClatchy says it plans to stay in business and will use bankruptcy to shed legacy debt and pension obligations. In California, at least 17 people were arrested during the third day of a wildcat strike by graduate students at the University of California, Santa Cruz. The hundreds of graduate students are demanding a cost-of-living adjustment of $1,412 per month, which student educators say is necessary to avoid living on the brink of homelessness as they teach classes and provide essential work to keep the university running in one of the most unaffordable cities in the country. The strike is not authorized by the local UAW union that represents student workers across the University of California system. And the Trump administration is facing public outcry over a proposal to weaken the National Environmental Policy Act. The law was enacted in 1970 to address growing concern with runaway pollution and the potential impacts of major projects like highways, dams, and mines. The Trump administration is attempting to fast-track new rules that govern how NEPA is implemented, slashing the environmental review time while eliminating any consideration of climate change as a potential impact of a project. Supporters of the changes include the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Koch-funded American Petroleum Institute. Earlier this week, the Council on Environmental Quality held a public hearing in Denver on the rule change. An indigenous-led rally opposing the NEPA regulatory rollback was held nearby, criticizing the proposed rules as well as the limited access the public had to the hearing itself. Advance online registration for the hearing was required and filled up within 2 minutes. Among those few who did get access to make a formal statement at the hearing was Alma Sanchez of the group Defenders of Wildlife.
I'm a 28-year-old Mexicana Guatemalteca who cares deeply about the environment, wildlife, our nation's public lands, and the health of all of our communities. While I am only 28, I am wise enough to understand and old enough to have witnessed that it is communities of color and economically disadvantaged communities that disproportionately are the victims of environmental contamination and pollution. Highways, refineries, power plants, and toxic waste are more likely to end up in my community. Our children are more likely to have asthma. NEPA is fundamental to protecting the health and rights of minorities and marginalized communities. NEPA forces the federal government to daylight its actions along with an accounting of the environmental effects. It gives the public a voice in the decision-making. That won't be the case under these proposed new rules. The government will not be obligated to consider and disclose the full array of environmental effects. Worse still, especially to my generation that has inherited the consequences and burdens of climate change, the government won't have to tell us how its actions, like leasing land for oil and gas development, will affect climate change. This is unacceptable to me. We all have a right to know what the government is doing and what the environmental fallout will be. This rulemaking is yet another gift to polluters and yet another blow to a clean environment and healthy communities. The Trump administration must withdraw this harmful proposal and stop harming communities like mine.
That was Alma Sanchez of Defenders of Wildlife at the NEPA regulatory rollback hearing in Denver Monday. The second and final planned public hearing is scheduled for February 25th in Washington, D.C. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Juan, before we begin our first story, the rise of Bloomberg in the polls to be the next president of the United States. You have long covered him through his 3 terms, from stop and frisk to this issue now of redlining.
Well, it's amazing to me that Michael Bloomberg has been getting as much attention as he has by the media. But remember this, the media, the commercial media directly profit from Bloomberg's rise because they're going to be collecting all the ad revenues that he is putting out across television nationwide. So there's an actual economic interest in continuing to see Bloomberg's rise in the poll on the part of many of the commercial media. But I think one thing that strikes me the most, Amy, is that I don't think any person in American history has ever spent more money cultivating an image in the public of himself as has Michael Bloomberg. Because when he ran for mayor 3 times in New York City, he spent $267 million just running for mayor. I think his last race, he spent $108 million, while his opponent, the Democrat, Billy Thompson, spent about $9 million. It was 11 times more. During that race, an average of 42 commercials a day on New York television throughout the race, Bloomberg commercials. But it wasn't just the direct contributions. He also, through his foundation, was spending about $100 million a year in donations to nonprofits, much of it to New York City nonprofits that was cultivating this sort of all these civic organizations that all were getting these huge checks named anonymous that they knew were from Michael Bloomberg. So the amount of money that this man spent just when he was for mayor of New York, now, of course, at the level of the national level, is unprecedented in terms of buying an image in the public. What he never talks about, though, is he has apologized for his stop and frisk policies, but if you look deeper into what happened during that period of time, not only did Bloomberg systematically defend stop and frisk for all those years, but his people attempted to smear the federal judge Scheindlin, who was on the case, and convince all of the media behind the scenes to write articles that she was biased and that she was unhinged.
To be clear, Judge Scheindlin was the judge who ruled that the stop and frisk policy was unconstitutional.
And as the Bloomberg administration saw that she was about to rule, they started a clear campaign quietly. Unlike Trump, who tweets against judges, they tried to convince all the newspapers of the city to write damaging editorials and exposés of the judge as a means to get her removed from the case. And the other policies of Bloomberg, whether it's the privatization of the public parks in the city, the massive privatization of public schools through expansion of charter schools, massive subsidies for commercial development in the city while rents skyrocketed. This is classic neoliberalism, and the idea that Democrats and some progressives might actually rally behind him, I find astonishing.
Well, remember, of course, he was a Republican mayor before he was an independent, and now a Democratic candidate. And this latest issue of redlining, of saying that was the cause of not redlining, but eliminating redlining was the cause of the financial crisis.
Yeah, well, there's been many historians, urban historians, who've documented that the real wealth gap in America between African Americans, Latinos, and the rest of the country is as a result of the systematic discrimination in lending policies for homes that went on for decades, and the idea that suddenly trying to provide fair underwriting policies for the African-American and Latino community caused the financial meltdown is really only a viewpoint of the extreme right, even of the Republican Party.
Finally, these scores of lawsuits against Bloomberg and his company around issues of sexual harassment. It was very interesting on The View, the ABC TV show, when Bloomberg went on it and I think just just recently in January. When he was asked about this, he commented that it was his company was just guilty of fostering bawdy humor, and said he would not take any steps to release women who signed confidentiality agreements, NDA agreements, with his company to speak publicly.
Well, that's especially important these days, given the fact of in the Me Too movement, how many of these companies impose these non-disclosure agreements as a way to keep their actions hidden from the public view. And I would think that if he's a candidate for president, he should definitely lift those non-disclosure agreements so we can find out exactly what was going on in his company.
Well, of course, we'll continue to cover not only Mayor Bloomberg, but all of the presidential candidates as this 2020 election season heats up.
Well, we begin today's show in Detroit, where a showdown between grassroots activists and the city is shining a spotlight on racist housing policies that robbed African Americans in Detroit of their homes and widened the wealth gap. On Thursday, with the support of Democratic Representative Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, the Coalition for Property Tax Justice announced a class action lawsuit against the city of Detroit, Wayne County, and the state of Michigan in response to unfair property tax foreclosures. 1 in 4 Detroit properties have been subject to property tax foreclosure, level comparable only to the foreclosure rates during the Great Depression. And according to legal experts, many of them were caused by illegally inflated property taxes that violated the state's own constitution. Even though Detroit tried to fix the problem in 2017, it's still overvaluing the lowest-priced homes. This is lifelong Detroit resident Sandra Bonet speaking during a press conference on Thursday. In 2015, her home was illegally foreclosed by Wayne County, which includes the city of Detroit.
Right now, what I tell the community every time I go out, it feels very personal to lose your home. You feel like you did something very wrong, like you just couldn't keep it together. But once I was informed by Professor Atuahene that the city illegally and unconstitutionally took my home, it lit a fire. And we began fighting. And this is where this fight has brought us. So I want to leave you with a couple of things today. Number one, this is an 85% black city. This would not be happening if this city was 85% white. You better believe that. 2 is, land is so very important. And they are stealing your land. We cannot let them get away with this yet again, because Lord knows they've stolen enough land.
Detroit is now 80% African-American, and 40% of Detroit's residents live below the federal poverty level. But as downtown Detroit becomes increasingly gentrified, thousands of Detroit's longtime residents, mostly African-American families, have lost their homes to foreclosure for property taxes they should not have been paying in the first place because the poverty tax exemption excuses those in poverty from paying. Well, for more, we go to Detroit, Michigan, where we're joined by Democratic Congress member Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, who's worked on this lawsuit from before the time she entered Congress. And we're joined by Bernadette Atuahene, a professor at Chicago Kent College of Law and research professor at the American Bar Foundation, member of the Coalition for Property Tax Justice. She's most recent study is titled Predatory Cities, forthcoming in the UC Berkeley Law Review later this month. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Congressmember Tlaib, you went back to Detroit for this major news conference. Talk about why this is so critical in your town, in your city of Detroit.
You know, I represent the third poorest congressional district in the country out of 435 congressional seats in the nation. And the human impact of what it feels like to not be offered the same equal rights that the majority of other Michiganders were getting. I mean, the due process of being able to get notice, to be able to have the right to appeal, but also the right to have your home assessed every year as required by not only the city charter, but the Michigan state constitution. So many of my residents, before I ever got elected, elected were coming to the Sugar Law Center for Economic and Social Justice saying something's not right here. I don't know. Why did I get this after the deadline? What is happening here? And when we filed the FOIA, we found out 260,000 Detroiters received the notice either late or even past the deadline. And it was devastating. The fact that they didn't even get the right to appeal it. And what we hear from the city administration and those folks that are in power to make the change is, well, it's their fault. They didn't do anything about it. But you didn't give them the option to do anything about it. So that's why I'm really commending the coalition and what we call the Detroit's professor over here, Bernadette, for pushing forward and speaking truth. I think that's what's been really hard. You heard from a mother recently of 7 children, and she felt like she did something wrong. And when she finally heard the data, heard that she was actually cheated out of her home, it felt liberating in some sense that she wasn't the one that was in the wrong. She shouldn't feel ashamed. The city of Detroit and those in power should feel ashamed. That's it.
And Congresswoman, I'd like to ask you in terms of the how this crisis is affecting not just Detroit, but across the nation, in terms of the wealth of especially of African Americans and Latinos because of the seizures of their homes and especially resulting from after 2008 mortgage meltdown, when so many other people went underwater.
Yeah, and that's one of the key things is, homes are economic stability. But many folks, just the historic nature, not only from Chicago to other really beautifully historic cities, majority black cities, what you know is these are homes that the families have been in there generations, yes. Generations after generations. You could probably go back, and I remember I was telling Bernadette this. There was this woman who was born in her home, senior citizen, in her 70s, and loses her home for less than $1,000. I mean, it's devastating to see something so ripped away from you. But yes, economic stability is so tied to home ownership. And the fact of the matter is, it's not only what happened here with this tax foreclosure crisis and, I think illegal taking, is that we also see that big banks, mortgage industry, others, there are still institutional systemic racism within their processes. We see it with settlement cases all across the country over and over again. I remember specifically in Financial Services Committee hearing about a whistleblower within Wells Fargo that was saying that he was taught and trained that if somebody came in with an accent to give a higher interest rate. So our communities of color all across the United States are facing barriers after barriers and these structural kind of racist approaches and processes. To me, what happened to many of my Detroit neighbors and not being offered due process and getting their homes taken away from them was completely wrong. The devastating part of it, too, was after I got into the United States Congress, when I found out millions of dollars that was sent to Detroit to address the blight, to address this housing crisis. When I found out that Detroit was ready, and I already had known this, Detroit was responsible for much of that. So the federal government is trying to fix an issue that was created by the own city administration is wrong. Look, it's in the charter. It's the law of the land in the city. You're supposed to assess people's homes, walking away from your responsibility and your duty, saying that, oh, everybody got notice, but you gave them notice after the deadline that they could actually appeal. It's simply wrong. And I think if you ask anybody across this country, the access to fairness and due process is so key. And that's why I think the class action suit is important. Not only do we have to fight in the streets to tell the truth and tell our stories, also onto the House floor of Congress or many other local governments, but also through the courts. Do we have to demand that we're treated with respect and dignity, to take people's homes away from them, where their children lives, their neighborhood, everything is ripped from them, all because somebody decided they didn't deserve it. They didn't deserve the process or equality and due process that everybody else gets around the state.
Professor Bernadette Atuahene, you teach at Illinois Institute of Technology at the law school there. You've done deep research into the racial wealth gap. If you can talk about the facts and figures behind this lawsuit, what it has meant, and how the Detroit mayor is currently responding to the class action suit and dealing with this illegal seizure of tax money or throwing people out of their homes.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So the first thing I want people to know is in Detroit, we have 1 in 4 homes that have gone through property tax foreclosure. 1 in 4. We haven't seen this number of property tax foreclosures in American history since the Great Depression. So the real question is, what is going on? And so I've done research that shows that between 2009 and 2015, anywhere in each of those 7 years, anywhere between 55 and 85% of properties were being assessed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution, which clearly says no property is to be assessed at more than 50% of its market value. And then when we looked at which houses were being overassessed, we found that 95% or more of the lowest valued homes were being overassessed, while the highest valued homes were actually being underassessed. And so the next study we did is because anytime you do research in Detroit and you don't deal with race directly, you're doing everyone a disservice. So the next study we did is we looked at Wayne County, and we looked at all the municipalities of Wayne County, and there's 3 that have a supermajority of African Americans, 70% or more: Detroit, Inkster, and Highland Park. And each of those majority black cities were being subjected to these unconstitutional tax assessments and foreclosures at a greater rate than the majority white cities. The third and final study we did looked at the relationship between these unconstitutional tax assessments and foreclosure rates. Because in fact, there's lots of things that can cause foreclosure, right? Poverty, a death in the family, etc. And so we needed to hold all of those variables constant to really isolate the effect of this one variable of unconstitutional tax assessments on foreclosure rates. And we're able to say that 10% of these historic rates of tax foreclosure in Detroit would not have happened but for these unconstitutional property tax assessments. That's 10% of all foreclosures. And when you look at just the kind of lowest valued homes, we're able to say 1 in 4, or 25% of those foreclosures would not have happened but for these unconstitutional property tax assessments. The city and the mayor in specific, their response to this overwhelming empirical evidence of illegality is to say, you know, if you thought you were being overassessed, you should have, in fact, filed an appeal, right? So moving the blame, the onus from the city to do the property tax assessments correctly to homeowners to, you know, saying they should have appealed. But what this lawsuit is all about, as Representative Tlaib has so clearly pointed out, is about the fact that the city did not even give people a chance to appeal. Why? Because in 2017, they mailed the property tax assessment notices late. And so they mailed them, in fact, late after the appeal deadline, meaning that Detroiters did not have an opportunity to appeal these illegally inflated property taxes. And that is the heart of this particular lawsuit. It is a due process lawsuit. Again, just fighting on behalf of Detroiters who are being overassessed and not given an opportunity to fight back.
And Professor, I wanted to ask you, obviously, that the super high assessments meant that those homeowners, especially in the poorest communities, were being required to pay more property taxes, right? Now, we're in a situation now, obviously, Detroit was in financial crisis for many years, and now all of these reports about how Detroit is coming back. What is the real story now as to how Detroit is coming back?
That's right. And let's just put this in context. Detroit has the highest property tax rate in the state of Michigan. It has the second highest tax rate in the United States. On top of these already high tax rates, they're being illegally assessed, meaning on top of the highest tax rates in the country, they are now being taxed even more, right? And so that's the starting point. And when you, what was the question again?
Well, they keep saying Detroit's coming back, Bernadette.
Oh, yes.
And one of the things you should know is if you go to my neighborhoods, they don't think, they're not coming back from whatever the heck their folks are saying they're coming back from. Poverty among children has actually increased in the city of Detroit. You see neighborhood after neighborhood that's been left behind. When they say come back, they're talking about the 7.2 miles. Yes. If you look at the census tracts, some of the wealthiest census tracts within the city of Detroit. They're talking about billionaires Dan Gilbert and the Illich family who continue to take tax giveaways from our school aid fund while literally down the street for their hockey stadium, for their for-profit development, while down the street, we have schools that don't have clean drinking water. We have schools that literally are closing down, these neighborhood schools that have been part of our anchors within our neighborhoods. So it is hard because I've actually had a senior citizen tell me, Detroit's coming back from where? You know, and why are they continually talking about only the downtown area and the surrounding kind of areas there? It's like an island, because anything beyond that island is real, true poverty, and people from those that can't afford their water bills, that literally one day their water gets shut off, the next day their children are being taken away from them. I mean, because they're saying, oh, they're negligent, but this is the same amount of money they're using for the for-profit industry that's even there for foster care. They won't even use it to help a woman get her water put back on. I mean, the hardship that we see our families facing, these are working class families. And even the young, the mother of 7, Sonia, she was saying that we're the ones out there in the restaurants that you don't look up and look at. We're the ones that are among you and your neighbors that have been part of the city of Detroit for so long. But they feel very truly left behind, not only with what's going on with property taxes, but what's going on, the devastation of our water shutoffs, the devastation of what's happening to our education system and so forth, the disinvestment in our neighborhoods that are surrounding downtown Detroit is extremely put such a tremendous hardship on so many of our families.
And we at the Coalition for Property Tax Justice like to think of the comeback story as a tale of two cities.
Yes.
Right? Because you have downtown Detroit. In downtown Detroit, the developers there are getting tax subsidies and tax breaks, when in the neighborhoods, they're being unconstitutionally assessed and foreclosed on at historic rates. Yeah. So when you think about Detroit coming back, again, as Representative Tlaib said, it's about a comeback for 7 square miles that includes downtown. When you look at the rest of Detroit, the majority of Detroit, and let's get real, Black Detroit, there is no comeback.
That's right.
So, Congressmember Rashida Tlaib, I wanted to ask you about a related issue, and this is at the presidential campaign level. Democratic presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg facing criticism over this recently resurfaced video clip that shows him blaming the 2008 mortgage and financial crisis on the elimination of the long-standing racist lending policy known as redlining. This is Georgetown University President John DeGioia speaking to Bloomberg in 2008.
You've made some reference to the elements that led to where we are today. Could you go a little bit deeper and tell us from your perspective, how did we get here? What are the root causes of the crisis that
you can go back. I would say it probably all started back when there was a lot of pressure on banks to make loans to everyone. Redlining, if you remember, was the term where banks took whole neighborhoods and said, people in these neighborhoods are poor, they're not going to be able to pay off their mortgages, tell them your salesmen don't go into those areas. And then Congress got involved, as local elected officials as well, and said, oh, that's not fair, these people should be able to get credit. And once you started pushing in that direction, banks started making more and more loans where the credit of the person buying the house wasn't as good as you would like.
So that was Mayor Bloomberg 12 years ago. Congressmember Tlaib, if you can respond.
Look, you know, I think of many of the folks that I serve with in Congress. Many of them are millionaires. They're completely disconnected with the American people. Mm-hmm. Even when the federal shutdown happened, you had literally colleagues on both sides. You know, I don't get it. Why are they in the food bank line? Why are the federal employees can't go and apply for a loan? There's just really disconnect to understand the American people live check by check. But also there's a disconnect that government's supposed to be about people, right? Our public tax dollars are supposed to be used to create economic stability, to increase home ownership, to create these programs that I think are win-win for everyone. Instead, you know, you have folks with a different kind of very narrow lens that see things through a different perspective than those that are on the ground. The majority of Americans do not live within that little bubble of the 1% and those that have. And so I think people like me are running for office finally, and we're winning because we are folks that are dealing. You know, I lived very, very humble backgrounds. I mean, I'm the eldest of 14, the child of immigrants. Both my parents, my dad only had 4th grade education, my mother 8th grade, and just kind of building it up and working very extremely hard for that. But it's really, it's sad when people that are in leadership positions don't understand that even if they don't get it, they have to surround themselves with people that understand what it means to live in poverty in America, what it means to go sleep hungry, what it means to live near corporate pollution, and what that means to your public health. It means so many things of various broken systems. And Amy, you know this. If I open the curtain and look behind that of all the broken system, from mass incarceration to what's happening in our immigration system, how dehumanizing it's becoming and caging children, to what's happening to our healthcare system, to our education system. It's become all for profit. People are making money off of the pain of our oppression. And that is something that I continue to speak truth to. So no matter who's running for office, I will demand that they talk about the P word, which is poverty. I will demand that they talk about the structural problems and issues and challenges, real structural problems that lead to people's oppression in our country. Well, and we have to continue to think beyond the same old recycled folks running for office. They had their chance. They did not change people's lives for the better. Then we have to move on. They didn't do the job to fix the structural problems that I feel like in some ways get left behind. They like Band-Aids. Band-Aids, the rain falls, it slips off, it doesn't work. We need real structural change so that when somebody walks in the door, they are offered an equal access to opportunities that get easily accessible to those that have.
Rashida
and so I continue, Amy, to push back against these kinds of narratives. And, you know, I want folks that are listening to know this. Just because somebody is a billionaire or millionaire does not mean they know what's best interest of the American people. It's those that actually have suffered along with them, that understand that suffering, that understand that oppression themselves. We need to hear more from them. We need those individuals to start running for office, because I truly believe those are the ones that people are waiting for.
Rashida Tlaib, we're going to ask you to stay with us just for another few minutes, because we want to ask you about this major moment this past week when the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, came to the UN Security Council responding to President Trump's so-called Middle East peace plan. You're the first Palestinian-American congresswoman. But I want to thank you, Bernadette Tuahene, professor of Chicago Kent College of Law at Illinois Institute of Technology and research professor at the American Bar Foundation, member of the Coalition for Property Tax Justice. We'll be back with Congressmember Rashida Tlaib in 30 seconds, and then we'll talk about this V-Day, this Valentine's Day, this day against violence against women and girls. Stay with us.
Desafiantes, ingobernables, lo rechazamos y no le tememos. Elegimos la libertad sobre el miedo, porque nuestros futuros están interconectados. Las vidas negras importan. Black Lives Matter. Ningún ser humano es ilegal. No human being is illegal. El agua es vida. Water is life. Basta de violencia machista and sexist violence.
No es mi presidente, not my president, performed by Taina Asili. And she's coming up on Democracy Now! In just a minute. But we wanted to stay with Congressmember Rashida Tlaib for just one more minute.
Well, we're continuing our conversation with Congresswoman Tlaib of Michigan, the first Palestinian-American woman elected to Congress. I want to ask you about President Trump's so-called Middle East peace plan. Earlier this week, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas forcefully rejected the plan during a speech to the UN Security Council Tuesday.
This plan will not bring peace or stability to the region, and therefore we will not accept this plan. We will confront its application on the ground. This is a summary of the project that was presented to us. This is the state that they will give us. It's like a Swiss cheese, really.
Swiss cheese.
Who among you will accept a similar state and similar conditions?
Well, Rashida Tlaib, you're the Congress member to Michigan's 13th Congressional District, along with Ilhan Omar. She is the first Muslim woman elected to Congress. Your response to the president's plan and to the response from the Palestinian Authority?
You know, I grew up in Detroit, the most beautiful, blackest city in the country. And so much of what I learned here of these forms of kind of oppression and structural, I think, racism that is so present in all different processes. But even just, you know, fighting right now in my own backyard against unconstitutional taking of people's homes by over-assessing their homes and everything, there's so many connectivity there to by what the current president is pushing forward and trying to basically legalize theft for so many of the Palestinian families that are left there. I can tell you, you know, for me, what's really critically important for people to understand that with all these terminologies, with colleagues always asking me, what does occupation mean? I want listeners to know, you know, what the human impact is of taking people's land, taking people's livelihood away from them. And this plan just continues to dig into that approach to what's happening in Palestine and Israel. And I can tell you, I want to hear more and more of those that are on the ground there, both Palestinian and Israelis who are against occupation, who want to see a true solution to there that actually involves them having a seat at the table. I think that that's not what's going to happen when the president just sits with his buddies and others that only see it through a very, I believe, racist lens that is this kind of othering politics. And also it's very demonizing in the way the president and even his son-in-law and others have depicted Palestinians as this is what they deserve. They don't deserve anything more. Well, I can tell you my grandmother lives in the West Bank and she deserves human dignity, and this does not provide her human dignity, especially in her last years. She is a kind, compassionate woman who just wants to live freely with equality, with the freedom to travel, with the freedom to access health care opportunities that help her have a better life.
Rashida Tlaib, we want to thank you for being with us. Democratic Congress member from Detroit, first Palestinian-American Congresswoman. This is Democracy Now! When we return, Taina Seeley and Eve Ensler. Stay with us.
In a time of an upheaval will come a transformation, ignite a fire that will burn like the sun, become a strong movement, fierce and determined, informed by where we are and where we've come from. We are those who are rising from Manila to Miami, building trust and solidarity. Love is our bond. And in the streets we are marching to end the rape and the
Taina Seeley, We Are Rising. She released the song For This V-Day in collaboration with 1 Billion Rising. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, this is Valentine's Day. People around the world are taking to the streets to protest violence against women and girls. From the Philippines to India to Italy to Bolivia, thousands of women in more than 100 countries will reclaim public space through dance and performance. The global movement is called 1 Billion Rising.
1 Billion Rising takes its name from the shocking statistic that 1 in 3 women across the planet will be beaten or raped during her lifetime. That's 1 billion women and girls. The movement started Valentine's Day 2012, has continued to grow every year since. They say they won't stop dancing until violence against all women, cis, transgender, and those with fluid gender identities has ended. Well, for more, we're joined here in New York by 2 guests: Eve Ensler, award-winning playwright, author of the Vagina Monologues, founder of V-Day and 1 Billion Rising, and Taina Seeley, the Puerto Rican singer, filmmaker, activist. We just heard her song, a part of it, We Are Rising. So, Eve, 1 Billion Rising, talk about the significance in this year, 2020. You started it, what, 8 years ago?
Yeah, we started 8 years ago, and we thought it would be 1 year campaign, and guess what? Dancing just spread like a fabulous virus around the world. I think this year, and I just want to say to all the activists who have already begun to rise. We're already getting videos from Australia in Byron Bay where women there really begin the day by taking off their clothes and diving into the ocean, doing a mad dance. They've risen at the presidential palace in the Philippines. The day has begun. And I think this year is really significant because of the rise, what we're seeing across the world, of fascism, of white supremacy, of desecration of the climate, of trans rights being obliterated, of workers' rights being obliterated. And I think one of the things we know from dance and from music is that it raises the vibration, so that all these kind of forces of darkness, whether they're the leaders of our own country or the Philippines or India, just this kind of low-level oppression, low-level hatred, what dance and music does is it lifts the vibration. So right now, in 180 countries that we know of, people will have already begun to rise and will keep rising. There are 29 states of India are rising. And what's beautiful about India is that they have joined forces with all the people rising against the Citizenship Amendment, so that we're seeing now in the 8th year how intersectional this movement has become, and how, like dance and like energy, it's brought all kinds of coalitions together. So in some places, indigenous people are rising for land rights and that corporations are taking for drilling. In some places, like last week, we rose in New York against Governor Cuomo for one fair wage. We rose with restaurant workers who are still living on tip wages and are facing some of the highest rates of sexual abuse. In villages in Zimbabwe, they're rising with tribal leaders who are now beginning to understand that violence against women must be part of the discourse and they must change basic cultural ways. So we're seeing this incredible diversity of risings, but the solidarity in terms of the fact that we know that women's bodies are the landscape on which so much violence is inflicted, whether it's the violence literally of rape, of harassment, of incest, of battery, or if it's the abuse of poverty, the abuse of denigration of migrant rights, the denigration of workers' rights, the denigration of LGBTQ rights. We're seeing this across the globe. And I have to say, I'm particularly proud because in places like Mexico, where they've been rising for the last 9 years against sex trafficking, they're having an impact on sex trafficking. In Hong Kong, where domestic workers have been rising for 8 years, they've actually changed laws, and they just got it so that women can no longer clean windows on the outside of high-rise buildings because so many women were dying. Well, they changed that law through their dancing. And we're seeing legislation changing. We're seeing culture changing, major culture shifts occurring because dance is so powerful.
Well, Taina, I wanted to turn to play more of the music video for the song We Are Rising and then ask you about your involvement as well.
From those who dare to interrupt the violence, to those who expose the truth and break the silence, warriors who work to open up the prison bars, valiant souls who stand up against the unjust wars, multitudes who defy walls along the border, masses who unify to protect our water, rebel minds who unionize for workers' rights, fearless hearts who fight to defend trans lives, those who take back their land and their health, those who seek to redistribute the wealth, youth who demand a right to education, those who reclaim political power in their nation.
That was Taina Asili. Taina, talk to us about how you got involved in this and also about the importance of music as a form of resistance.
Right. Well, you know, for the past 20 or more years, I've been doing social justice songwriting. I've been addressing issues of climate justice, issues of mass incarceration. You know, we heard No Es Mi Presidente, which I wrote after the last presidential elections. And a lot of my music has been identified as anthemic, right, anthem music. And so last year, I was really sitting with this concept of what does it mean to write anthems for our movements? And so I was sitting with that as I was heading down to the Beyond the Bars conference in New York. And as it happens, Eve was there and was also thinking about this idea of a new anthem for 1 Billion Rising. So the two came together really nicely. You know, for me, I see what I do, this idea of writing anthemic music, writing music for social change as a part of my legacy as a Puerto Rican woman. My mother was a dancer, my father was a singer, and they were both keepers of our Puerto Rican cultural traditions. And so from that point until today, you know, I've seen all of the music that has come out of my cultural background as a Puerto Rican, from bomba y plena to hip hop to reggaeton, and you know, and all of that as a part of the work that I do today. You know, to me, when we look at the history of oppression, art, creativity, music has always gone hand in hand. It's a part of our human gift. So, you know, that's something that sat with me, and this is the craft that I've been honing in on and trying to think about, not just thinking about it from a U.S. perspective, but also a global perspective, and how to intersect with 1 Billion Rising's work that they're doing around the globe. So it's been a beautiful challenge.
I remember bumping into you and interviewing you at the first Women's March in 2017 when you sang on the stage outside of, well, it was the next day after President Trump, you know, in the audience he had, though significant, it was much larger the next day when the women, hundreds of thousands of women came to protest. Yeah. This issue of the global women's movement, Eve, that Taina was just referencing, this issue of intersectionality and where you are now in 2020.
I think it's so important. I mean, I was thinking today, you know, we have actors, artists, indigenous folks, we have farmers, we have Adivasi women, we have Dalit women, I mean, across the globe. And I think one of the things we're seeing, we've even changed our mission this year, which is, Vide is now about ending violence against all women and girls and the Mother Earth, because we understand that we can't be addressing violence against women unless we're addressing climate crisis. I mean, and also how we feel about women's bodies is so much how we feel about the Earth. The same raping, the same pillaging, the same taking without permission, the same not thinking of long-term consequences of our violence. And I think if we look what's happened to the movement over the last 8 years, it's organically understood that you can't end violence against women without addressing all the attending issues. You can't do it without addressing morbid inequality of wealth and capitalism. You can't address it without addressing imperialism and colonialism. You can't address it without addressing how we're treating workers and workers' rights. And because so many women are the front lines of low-paying jobs or jobs that are literally holding the world up with little respect. So I think what's beautiful is to see how we've unsiloed this movement and how in some ways it's easier to do in other parts of the world, because in places like the Philippines or India, they have built-in movements and coalitions that are coming together through dance. And I think dance has made it easier in some ways, because dance opens up the heart, it opens up the binaries, it opens up spaces where people can literally feel their humanity, feel their bodies, be in collective spaces together, take back public spaces that have been denied to women who have been so abused, and reclaim those spaces as theirs. And I think we are literally slowly, over these 8 years, we're building a movement that is not only intersectional, it's artistically and intersectional, which means it has some kind of new vibration that is bringing these issues together in a way that feels holistic and organic.
We want to end with the very music, Taina, that we've been playing throughout, that is your music. We Are Rising on this Valentine's Day. We want to thank you both, Eve Ensler, award-winning playwright, author of The Vagina Monologues, and Taina Sili, singer, filmmaker, and activist, as we go out with We Are Rising.
In a time of an upheaval will come a transformation, ignite a fire that will burn like the sun, become a strong movement, fierce and determined.
We Are Rising, Taina Sili, and you can see the whole thing at democracynow.org, and the website for We Are Rising, 1 Billion Rising, Eve, is
1billionrising.org, and over 500,000 people have already watched this video, so please watch and spread it everywhere.
We want to thank you all for being with us on this V-Day. Democracy Now!, by the way, is accepting applications for a paid year-long news production fellowship here in our New York studios. Get the information at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez for Democracy Now!
To stop the